Millennials have impacted the world in many significant ways. I'm Ben Egnall.
And I'm Fang Yu.
And as two millennials, we thought it was time that we had a podcast of our own. In each episode, we'll feature something that millennials have killed, whether it's an institution, a cultural pastime, or something as common as your ex-girlfriend's favorite cereal. We'll also shine a light on how we're killing it. We'll bring on an expert and we'll vote to see once and for all if it deserves the verdict of millennials killed that.
Today we'll discuss how exactly millennials are killing car ownership. And we'll be joined by James Pio, a transportation planner. This is Millennials Killed That. We're a couple of millennials trying to make sense of the world we're living in. Welcome to Millennials Killed That. Today we're talking about car ownership. So let's get right into it. Why are we even talking about this, Ben?
You tell us.
The National Automobile Dealers Association's chief economist has said that car buyers are getting older and richer. More than half of adults between the ages of 22 and 37 say a car is not worth the money spent on maintenance and that they would rather be doing something other than driving. And we know as well that driving is losing its popularity amongst younger people. Only 58% of 25-year-olds have a license. By comparison, 94% of 55-year-olds have theirs. So, speaking of licenses, let's get into our own experience with car ownership. And for me, in Canada, you have 3 levels. I'm basically like in the elementary school version of driving school. Like, I know nothing about cars, I know nothing about driving a car, and I don't own a car.
However, for a few years in the advertising industry, you worked exclusively with Ford.
Yeah, as they say, fake it till you make it. So I was definitely faking it.
My experience growing up, I never had any interest in cars. I didn't really like driving. I didn't want to drive. Finally, though, I think at the ripe age of 22 or 23, when it became embarrassing to say you didn't have a license.
Oh, shots fired.
I finally got my G1. That's after failing my G1 test first. And then similarly, it took me 2 or 3 tries to finally get my G. And after all of that, it's really nice now having my license and being able to drive when I want. But I definitely wasn't one of those enthusiastic kids where right when you turn 18 or 19 or 17 or whatever the age is, you run out and you immediately get your license.
Yeah, neither of us were. And what about owning a car?
I actually was the lucky recipient of my parents' old car, other than the gas and, as we'll dive in further, the tickets and insurance that tend to add up.
And parking.
And parking.
Yeah.
So let's dive right into how we might be killing it. You want to walk us through it?
Sure. So the first reason we're talking about is we're leaning into technology that doesn't revolve around car ownership to get around. I think a lot of these are going to be really common names for a lot of us now. You know, ride sharing is really as common as hailing a cab. I'm sure there is a generation of young urban children who will not know what it's like to have to call up a cab company and put in an order that way. Because we're seeing places like Uber, Lyft, and all of that. There's such a part of cab hailing experience now that you don't even think about it.
I mean, I was a very late adopter to Uber. You know, when I wasn't taking the subway everywhere, I took cabs everywhere. The idea of hopping in a car with a total stranger seems so insane to me. But now, I think I took 1 cab last year, and it was the worst experience you get in. It stunk. It was sticky. And then at the end of the trip, you're kind of fumbling for change. You're trying to calculate the tip. And now just the whole idea of Uber where immediately they know where you're going. You know, you don't have to pull out a card or money at all. It just makes the whole thing so seamless. One thing about Uber that took me a while to figure out was the rating system. For the longest time, I had no idea that we were rated. I only assumed that we rated them.
You thought it was one way.
Oh, I thought it was one way. I thought, I'm going to rate you, and you can't tell me nothing.
Does that mean that you were behaving really badly?
I was not behaving well in this sense. I wasn't, being a bad passenger once I got in. But I think very oftentimes they'd be waiting a few minutes. And then it wasn't until one day I checked my Uber rating. I think I had about a 4.4.
That's better than mine.
What?
Yeah.
I was just shocked. And then ever since then, I've been on my best Uber behavior every trip.
It's probably because we take Ubers together, so they've had to wait for both of us because you didn't realize that we were getting rated. So
you're saying
I got dinged.
I've been bringing your Uber rating
Yeah,
down.
exactly. For all the Uber drivers who are listening to this, if you rated me, it's probably because you rated both of us.
Sorry.
And bike sharing programs are also not new and again getting very commonplace in big cities. In Toronto, we have had access to bike sharing for a while now, and I know just from traveling around a little bit in North America the last couple of years, we know that they're big in, again, like most of the big cities in the US. Ohio University ran a survey that found 19% of millennials bike once a week compared to 16% of Gen X and 12% of boomers. And since I don't have a car or the right license, this is my main way of getting around if it's further away than somewhere that I can walk to.
Anytime I have the option, anytime, it's within a few miles, I'll definitely bike.
I think what's so funny about how much you bike, because you are a very avid biker, is there have been times where I will say, like, why don't you drive to wherever? Because in my mind, it's easier for you to do it that way, especially if it's something that involves, like, getting groceries. That would just be easier with a car. Mm-hmm. And you said that because our car is so hard to maneuver sometimes in parking spaces, to you said, like, that's such a hassle to get in and out of the parking lot that you would rather bike and carry heavy loads.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're carrying groceries and you can balance the bag on either side, if I have the option, I'd always bike over driving any day of the week.
And some possible future trends that we're seeing in terms of ride sharing, we're seeing that electronic scooters are being more popularized in urban areas. I know you said you saw this was it Atlanta that you went to earlier last year?
Yeah, so for my bachelor party, myself and a bunch of friends went to Atlanta, and it was the first time I'd been in a city with scooters, and we just went everywhere on the scooters. Sometimes when we had nowhere to be, we're just like, what, we have an hour to kill, let's just scoot around the city. But warning, they're incredibly dangerous. And I think you can also talk about this too. They're everywhere. They litter the streets. People, after having a couple beverages, will get on them with no helmets, and they can be a real menace.
Yeah, there was even, I forget what city we were in, that had scooters and also had like high winds, but there was one weekend, it felt like a joke story that you see on The Onion where it was like, oh, tornado warning. And because there are so many scooters in the city, there was a real like warning that needed to be put out so that people wouldn't get hit by scooter tornadoes.
Oh my God. Yeah. People in cities like San Fran are so fed up with them. They'll just throw them in dumpsters, they'll smash them, they'll throw them in rivers. I think it's a great thing for tourists, but for instance, if scooters came to Toronto, I mean, our already busy sidewalks would just go over the rails.
Right. So I think maybe the verdict is still out on how successful scooter sharing programs are going to be, but it speaks to this trend of people wanting more sharing options in terms of transportation. And before we move on to the next point, we also want to talk about something that's been around in terms of ride sharing for as long as we can remember transportation being a thing, which is public transit. And even back in 2014, a survey of 10 U.S. cities found that 3 in 4 millennials said it is likely they will live in a place where they do not need a car to get around. And I'm definitely one of the 3 of these people.
So what would you say your experience is with public transit, for better or for worse?
For the better. I've had really good public transit experiences. I mean, I grew up in Singapore, and the public transit system there is really quite good. We've got
really clean.
Really clean. Really safe, and there's buses as well as subways that have been around for as long as I've lived there.
When I couldn't get a ride home from school, I would just hop on the TTC, Toronto, wait a minute, what's it stand for?
Toronto Transit Commission. So you use it often, eh?
We just know by the acronym. That's good to know. But yeah, I mean, like every day to school, every day home from school. And it was great. Obviously, delays, but generally good and generally clean.
It's funny that neither of us brought this up until now because we met in New York. And New York has possibly one of the best public transit systems in the world. Mm-hmm. In terms of getting you from A to B, it is the best experience that I've had. Although, in terms of sexual harassment, it is the worst.
You were catcalled a few times.
No, on public transit in New York, I was groped.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So I think that's not specific to public transit itself. I think that is something that happens in New York City. But, like I said, if we're just talking about how efficient and valuable the actual system is, New York is up there. So I've had really good experiences generally in terms of transportation with public transit, and I'm not surprised that it's such a common thing that millennials are really into.
I mean, one detriment, just while we're on public transit, is coming from New York to Toronto. Toronto obviously felt very roomy on the subway. New York during rush hour, you can hear the song on the person next to you in their headphones. You can taste exactly what the person sitting next to you had for lunch.
Ugh.
I mean, you had absolutely no personal space. What's funny is in New York, people would literally squish themselves like Tetris pieces until there's not a single little inch left. Where in Toronto, there's often there's a lot of room and people are so nice. They would never survive in New York.
I was thinking that when I first moved to Toronto and I saw that people would wait for the next subway car, I'd be amazed. I'd be like, wow, people are either not in a rush or there's this cultural politeness thing that I'm seeing firsthand because of public transit.
So let's move on to our second reason. Owning a car is a big hassle for us. I mean, maybe too much of a hassle.
I would agree. I mean, that's part of the reason why I don't have a car.
So, I mean, this is obviously a reoccurring topic for a lot of our podcasts, and that's the financial issues. So, with student loan debts, we really don't want to dig further into that by buying a car. A car is, other than a house, I would say one of the biggest investments you can make. We're very careful about what we spend our money on, especially when it comes to big investments. As soon as you buy a car and you drive it off the lot, the old myth says it loses half of its value as soon as you drive off.
My family experience is that we've leased vehicles. I actually don't, we should have dug into this more, I will admit, but I don't know if we can compare what the value is between leasing over a number of years and then owning for a couple of years. But I bet you, if you are only leasing for a couple of years and then you can trade in for a new one, wouldn't the value of your vehicle usually be higher?
It's a good question. I'm not sure about the finances.
So to wrap up on that point, we have student loan debts, a lot of us do as millennials, and we see another bill that we have to pay for in terms of buying a new car as one more bill. And I think just one more bill for a lot of us can push us into thinking that cars are too much of a hassle for us to get into.
So I got an incredibly sweet deal when I was essentially handed the keys, if you will, for the Acura. All I had to do was pay for insurance, gas, and tickets.
Parking.
And parking, yeah. We were very careless in the first couple of years we had the car.
We were just dumb. We didn't know.
It would be rush hour on a major street, and we'd leave the car for, true story, we'd leave the car for about 20 minutes, and we'd come back and be gone. And when your car gets towed, I mean, first of all, it's a total shock to the system. Second of all, it's expensive. I think it was about $300, $400 just to get it back.
Yeah. We should have learned the first time that it happened. And it got to the point where we had tickets from the same towing company. And by the end, I'm pretty sure I could memorize their number. It would just be like, oh, it's towed. Let's call JP Towing.
Yeah.
Shout out JP Towing.
So lastly, our third reason why we might be killing cars is that cars don't hold as much sentimental value for us as they did in previous generations. It's not really a rite of passage. Growing up, I think for our parents' generation, in a lot of ways, cars were romanticized. This getaway, and there was movies about cars and songs about cars. And I don't think, other than Fast and the Furious, cars have necessarily permeated the popular culture quite as much.
I wonder about that, though. I think Fast and the Furious, which is really the biggest car fanatic series of our time that millennials are really into, they're so out of our league that it's beyond aspirational. So there's no point in us thinking that we could afford something like that. So why bother?
Yeah, I mean, actually today, I was driving somewhere, and I saw a bunch of guys just standing. I mean, they should have been social distancing.
Oof.
But a bunch of guys standing around like a 1970 Gran Torino. And they were just kind of standing around admiring it. Maybe they had the hood up. You look at the previous generation, and for boomers, cars were really it wasn't only a status symbol, it was this investment. And it was something where you could actually pop the hood and know that what the hell was going on. They knew cars, they knew car parts. And for them, it was this like big source of pride. For us, I mean, maybe it's partly because cars have become so generic now. Like back in the day, they looked very distinct, and I don't know, they seem like more kind of beautiful and artfully done. And now cars, like, no shots fired, but I feel like they're more generic potentially.
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean, though. I'm thinking of Archie comics when Archie always has to, like, get his car fixed. And obviously, that because I get all my car education through Archie comics, that's what I think of when I think of, like, older generations knowing about their cars and having to spend time, which they enjoyed, on fixing their vehicles.
Totally. And I think, I don't know, it's like almost like are we like a wussier generation in some ways? Like, I feel like to kind of like be a grease monkey and roll up your sleeve and pop the hood and know exactly what an exhaust is and like know how to fix the car. There's something cool and like very Clint Eastwood about that.
Well, I think one thing that we did find in our research is that millennials are a little bit more eco-conscious as well. So for us, because cars, as you just said, are such like greasy, gas-guzzling vehicles, for some of us, that's not an appeal. It's right. Going to take away from the niceness of the car, and it's going to be something that we see as like a disadvantage.
Yeah, and I don't know if this point goes exactly into the sentimental category, but it just more in general with driving. You see, some people have the driving bug. I love driving in the country. It's just not very fun driving in the city. If you get stuck in a car in rush hour, it's such a nightmare. And I think real driving, when you're just kind of open road, gunning it a little bit, that's where the love of driving can really, be romanticized.
Yeah. And also, when you're in a longer car ride, you can listen to podcasts.
Like this one.
So let's talk about some ways we're not killing it. Millennials are now only entering their peak car buying years. So I feel like, we've only done a couple of episodes right now, but I feel like this is going to be a recurring thing that we see where millennials are at this like turning point in terms of consumer behavior in a lot of different categories, and cars is one of those. So despite the fact that millennials have had the lowest car ownership rates at 68%, they are also the cohort most interested in owning a car in the future.
We don't need a car right now. I mean, it's nice, right, when we go to a cottage or pick up lots of groceries, but a car's not an absolute necessity. But I think once we have kids, major discussion.
We've never had this discussion before.
Guys, what's happening right now? Then we'll probably need cars. And it just doesn't make sense when you have a family not to have a car.
For a lot of people, right.
Most of us are getting to the point where we're almost done paying off student loans.
Hopefully.
So a lot of experts and various studies we've seen feel like because we're just getting over the hump right now, a lot of sales are about to shoot up.
Right. So because we're seeing that shift in really wanting to buy as well as financial ability to buy, we should be seeing car ownership shoot back up. And
our second point in terms of why we might not be killing it, although we're not big car owners ourselves, we're big car riders. So in 2018, a survey conducted in densely populated cities, millennials were consistently spending at least $100 on ride-sharing apps a month.
I would say I was probably in that category the first year that I used Uber, especially in North American cities that have cold winters. It was just so easy that I had to cash in and use those as much as I could.
And I feel like it's so easy to be lazy, not calling you lazy, but myself included, just to be lazy and get in the habit of using them. Okay, I could spend $3.25 on the subway, or I could spend $5 on an Uber ride, and Uber will get me there so much quicker, and I'll have to walk less. Back to the laziness.
And recent research shows as well that about 15% of millennials are planning to drive for services like Lyft or Uber. So obviously, because there's such a huge uptick in people using ride-sharing apps, there's got to be people driving as well. And those drivers, it's not like a cab anymore where you have to buy a specific kind of vehicle. You can buy whatever vehicle you want, but you still need to buy a car. So those car owners are coming out from this increase in app usage.
So I have a question for you, personal question.
Okay.
What is your favorite kind of Uber driver?
The ideal Uber driver is one that can match how I'm feeling. So I'm usually quiet when I'm in an Uber, especially if I'm by myself. to the point where I would think that, like, if I'm being quiet, you would be able to sense that I
Mm-hmm.
maybe don't want you to talk to me. And if I'm feeling chatty, I'm very much like, oh, how's your day? I'll engage in conversation. I'll start conversations. So I think the right Uber driver, it's like anybody who works in service. You can sense how your customer is feeling. But I will say, from personal experience, probably the most pleasant and enjoyable driver that I had. She was female, which first of all is more
Very
unusual.
rare.
Yeah, she was so friendly, and the first thing she said was, "Hello, I'm your Uber mama.
Ah!
I'm gonna be your driver today, and I will take care of you." And
Ah!
I felt very reassured. I felt like nothing wrong was gonna happen, and I'd have a great ride. And she played like fun music, and she was just like, really pleasant.
That's awesome.
Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, generally, I probably talk less on Ubers, but then when I find somebody I do want to talk to, I'll dive in. They ask me what I do. I say designer, art director. There was a woman who has a budding rap career, and she was looking for new album cover art. So the type of people who you meet driving Ubers are really run the spectrum. It's really fascinating.
That's true. I remember that you and I were in an Uber once where the driver was some kind of MMA fighter. And he was trying to get us to come out to a show, but we were clearly just like so uninterested. And at the end of it, he'd given us a business card for us to go watch his shows. And it was just like...
I actually went to that show.
No, you didn't.
No, I didn't.
Yeah. Anyway, it struck me as like not reading the room.
No, definitely not. So we're excited to have James on, and we're going to talk to him about whether he thinks that millennials killed car ownership. Stay tuned.
So James, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today.
My pleasure.
Can you give us an explanation about what you do and what your expertise is in?
I've worked as a transportation planner in various levels of government. My expertise is in transportation demand management, which is a kind of a niche area that deals with influencing travel behavior. I've been trying to get commuters to shift modes from like being a solo driver to carpooling and using transit and whatnot.
Okay, which kind of sounds like you want to reduce the amount of car ownership that exists in cities.
So you would say you personally are not a car person?
Definitely not.
So what are the trends that you've seen in car ownership as a planner?
Well, first off, I'm seeing new buildings getting put up with fewer and fewer parking spaces. Many property developers are building fewer parking spaces than the minimum required by the zoning bylaw, which not only saves them money, but to me it indicates that they are anticipating lower rates of car ownership moving forward.
And are you seeing this trend in like downtown core as much as you are seeing it in like suburban areas, or are there different trends in those different areas?
It's mainly a downtown trend.
And do you know if there are any plans for like other kinds of ride sharing? Like we know that, for example, in the city of Toronto, we've got the, they're not called Bixie bikes anymore, but the...
Toronto Bike Share.
Can you speak a little bit more about trends like that? Like, do you think that we're going to get more of those, or like scooters or anything?
I think definitely there's an entire area known as micromobility, which deals with e-scooters, sort of what they call first and last mile solutions.
My only worry about scooters is that our sidewalks are crowded, obviously with people. Yeah, and then bike lanes, because scooters are much faster than bikers. I almost wonder that there's not enough lanes on the street or sidewalk to make it, there might be a safety concern.
Some of these scooters, they do go much faster than bikes, and that is a concern that everybody has now. Do we consider them bikes, or do we consider them more like motorcycles? Most jurisdictions don't really have the policy framework to actually work with them.
So how do you plan for the future of transportation? I mean, it sounds like with scooters, that's one factor, but are there things that you do in your work that helps you plan for the unknown?
Basically, we get a bunch of experts into a room and get an idea of what disruptors are coming.
When you talk with these experts, do they have anything specific to say about how millennials are getting around, or what millennials are looking to see in the future?
There seems to be a consensus that millennials are not driving as much as past generations. We would prefer our smartphone over a new car. That's kind of the stereotype about millennials, that we're always on our phones.
I would be one of those millennials. I'd much rather have my phone than a car.
I mean, I think the thing about cars is It is difficult because we're so phone obsessed. So, anytime I find myself driving and there's a red light, I'm immediately want to check my phone. And I think people, whether you're taking public transportation or something like that, it's much easier to be connected to your phone. So what do you see, let's say 50 years from now, what do you see as the future of cars being, other than flying cars like in The Fifth Element, which I'm fingers crossed open for?
If you had like an ideal state, what would it be?
Well, in terms of an ideal state, I would hope that if we do have cars, they would be shared. I think dystopia would be a bunch of single occupant or empty cars on the highway congesting the roads.
It reminds me of an article I read a while back, which essentially said the future of cars in many ways is going to parallel our relationship to music ownership. Back when 20 years ago, people would individually buy music. If you liked an album, if you liked the record, you go out and you buy a physical thing and you'd own that. And then, over time, it became this online platform to share. In the future, people who potentially individually own cars might be few and far in between.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people are hoping for, that they would subscribe to a service, just kind of like Car2Go, right? And instead of paying for your own insurance and you're maintaining your own vehicle, subscribing to a service would achieve more economies of scale.
On that note, should we go around and ultimately vote on whether we think that millennials have killed car ownership?
Let's do it. James is our guest. Would you like to vote first?
Yes, I believe millennials are killing the car, at least getting there. I think it's because we're using car sharing services more, and in the past 10 years, we've seen a number of different models of car sharing and ride sharing services emerge. More than ever, it's become easier to survive without owning a car.
What do you think, Fang?
I think my vote would be, as much as I'm not a car person, I don't think millennials have killed car ownership, even though there has been a decline. I think that we're seeing a lot of reasons for that decline that we've gone over, but because we're about to be making money that will allow us to get cars, and because we're getting to that point in our lifestyle where we might need a car more than ever, and because of COVID, I think we're going to see quite a surge in car ownership in the next couple of years. But I think that the generation after us could kill car ownership. What about you, Ben?
No, I don't think that millennials are killing car ownership. I think because we are based in a city with public transportation, it's easy for us to look at our world around us and think that fewer and fewer people are owning cars. But when you look at rural cities in and around North America and the world, people rely on cars every single day to get around. Until that fundamentally changes, maybe scooters, people will have a need for car ownership.
Well, that keeps things interesting. I mean, not every expert we have on is going to vote the same way we do. So, James, thanks again so much for coming on and taking our vote with us. Is there anything that you wanted to plug or talk about that you do as well that you want to share with our audience?
If anybody wants to find me, they're more than welcome to come on my blog. It's www.jamespo.com, TYO.com.
Well, thanks again for coming on.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and thanks for joining us on this episode.
Yeah, thanks, James.
So that was our car ownership episode. We kept things a bit spicy with, not unanimous votes. If you have any thoughts on whether you agree or disagree, we'd love to know. You can follow us on Instagram at Millennials Killed That, and you can follow us on Twitter at MKT Podcast.
What will we kill next?
We'll find out. Stay tuned. Bye.